This is the 4 p.m. program, Poetry and Play, and here I have with me today poets Chen Chen, Darrel Alejandro Holnes, Rachel Mannheimer, and Bianca Stone, and the moderation will be by Gala Mukomolova. A round of applause for them.
Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that the books by authors in this program can be purchased from the community bookstore. The authors will also be signing their books immediately following this program at the signing table next to the stage. Authors, at the conclusion of the program, please go directly to your signing tables. At the conclusion of this program, we ask everyone to leave their seats so that the next audience can be seated. So, we can begin with author bios. Chen Chen is a writer whose debut, When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a List of Further Possibilities, was longlisted for the National Book Award and won the Thom Gunn Award, among other honors. His work appears in many publications, including poetry, 3 editions of the Best American Poetry, has received 2 Pushcart Prizes and fellowships from Kundiman, NEA, and United States artists. His book, Your Emergency Contact, is Experience in Emergency, is out now from BOA editions. Darrel Alejandro Holnes is an Afro-Panamanian American writer. His most recent play, Black Feminist Video Game, was produced by the Civilians for 59E59. Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Center Theater Group, and other theaters and venues, and won an inaugural Anthem Award. Holnes is the author of Migrant Psalms and Stepmotherland. He is the recipient of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize from Letras Latinas, Drinking Gourd Poetry Prize, C.P. Cavafy Poetry Prize from Poetry International, and a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship in Creative Writing Poetry. His latest book is Stepmotherland. Rachel Mannheimer was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, and lives in New Haven, Connecticut, where she works as a literary scout and as a senior editor for the Yale Review. Her first book, Earthroom, was selected by Louise Gluck as the inaugural winner of the Bergman Prize and published by Changes in April 2022. And finally, Bianca Stone is a poet and artist. Her books include The Mobius Strip Club of Grief, Tin House 2018, Someone Else's Wedding Vows. Her poetry has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The Nation. She teaches classes on poetry and consciousness in Vermont, where she's the creative director at the Rootstone House. Her most recent book is What is Otherwise Infinite. All right. Shall we begin? Perfect. All right, so I have sort of the general kind of brain collecting question, which is the theme of this panel is poetry that uses humor, pop culture, and political histories as artistic strategies. And I mean, sure, these things overlap, but they are incredibly divergent topics. So what would you suppose ties them together?
Oh, I shouldn't have made a sound. I'm not ready to answer.
Well, I would say that they are tied together by poetry. Or just that one of the wonderful things about poetry is that it can hold all of these things, all of these tones, and all of these ideas in one modest vessel. And yeah.
Would you agree with that?
I suppose I would agree with that. I'm going to take this out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I was really excited to be invited to this panel because of the title, Poetry and Play. I think that these are all strategies that we can use, to use the language of the description of the panel, but more than anything, I think of it as something that we can play with. I think of poetry as something that for me comes out of experiments. And so I like to play with pop culture in particular when I'm making my poems and to see what comes out of them and to see if what comes out really expresses the idea that I had in mind or if it teaches me something new about the idea that inspired me to write the poem. So.
Yeah, I'm going to take this off because it's so hot. Actually, when you bring up play, I was thinking about your specific section in your book called Links. and how much sound seems to govern the rhythm of that play. And I wondered if I could pose a question just kind of inspired by those particular pages to the audience, and well, no, to you guys as my captive audience, about how much, you know, the craft element of play governs how you write your poems.
Yeah, when I wrote that poem, I was thinking about the kind of songs that we sing on the playground when we're playing hand games. And I was thinking about the way that so many people, when they were enslaved, would pass on secrets through music, and what kinds of secrets or stories could be passed down even through those hand games. And there's a whole melody that goes with this poem, and I didn't actually come up with it until I was in a cab, good old yellow taxi cab in New York City, not an Uber or a Lyft, but a cab. And I was taking a cab down to the New York Poets Cafe to perform it for a Black Lives Matter related fundraiser poetry event. And I got a text message from the organizer saying that I was like going on last, and she had all these high expectations for me. And I was like, this is not what I signed up for. Why am I doing this? And I just was like, well, I better make this special. And I just came up with the melody for it in the cab. And I think that if there's always play in the poem, in the composition of the poem, then there can be play in the performance of the poem, then there can be play in, you know, even talking about the poem. And so even if the topic is serious, you know, because that obviously relates to all of these serious topics, but I knew that I wanted to find a way to experiment and to still have some fun with it.
Yeah, I don't know, because there seems to be a kind of separation in the themes here, because when I was thinking about the idea of play, I wasn't necessarily thinking about history and pop culture and reference in poetry. There's something about play for me that allows in those things into my own sort of sacred experience, just with my own consciousness. And I think when I think of like how we interact with all the things in the world around us that are so contradictory, you know, what we experience in politics, how we experience our families, how we experience pop culture and our conflicted feelings about it, and our conflicted relationships. I think of play as being the only creative recourse to work those things out. And I think there's a lot of painful things that we have to deal with in our culture, and play ends up being a very necessary and serious act. And poetry is perfectly poised to do that.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, please take it from there.
Yeah, I love your emphasis on contradictions.
Yeah.
Particular emotional contradictions, which I feel all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think poetry is one of the great spaces to exist in contradiction, to play with contradiction. Yeah, play is essential to my writing, to my life. I can't really write a poem until I feel like I'm playing in it, in language, in tone, in the subject, in the form, etc. It has to feel malleable, like I can move around in it, like it's, you know, a playground. And just a thought back to the first question about what ties these things together. I think for me it's surprise. I write toward surprise, and that feels very related to play. I often think about this in terms of outfits, because I love thinking about putting together an outfit, or when you go browsing or shopping. Like I used to feel, both in clothes and in poems, that I had to like keep really distinct. Like, this is a serious poem now. This is the silly one. And it took a lot of trial and error to figure out how those elements could go together. But now that's the thing that excites me the most, actually, is being surprised by how disparate elements can come together. And so, like, when I'm, looking for a belt or, a harness, something, I will choose something that I'm just excited about as an item, like on its own. Mm-hmm. And so I think about that with lines sometimes, where I'm like, I don't know where this might go in a poem, but I love this line, I love this harness, so I'm going to get it. And then I will try to incorporate it, right? I'll try to see what kind of worlds I can build around that thing that I'm excited about. Yeah.
Wow. I actually want to come back to this topic of emotional contradictions. I feel like there's a lot of that happens through all of these books. And I'm wondering, are emotional contradictions something that you all find yourselves bringing to the work to work out? Or is it something that the work brings to you as you're doing it?
I think it's both ends up happening. There's this sort of suffering that happens with contradictions. Like, how can I love this person and hate them so much? Like one of your parents, for just to throw a random example out there. And it feels really intolerable and unbearable. And poetry is built upon this contradiction. I think the idea of metaphor itself and simile is full and rife with contradiction, because you're saying these two unlike things are actually alike. And it's limitless, really, what you can compare. And in that contradiction is a lot of the playfulness, I think. And what I find surprising in reading poetry and in writing it is that I don't fully understand my feelings about something. And then the more I write, the more I surprise myself. There's the element of surprise in terms of what comes out. So like a lot of this is unconscious material that you're sort of teasing out. And then I also find that looking back on my poems years later, that I'm baffled at what I see there that I didn't see originally in the onset of writing the poem, or even after the publication. But maybe years later I look back and my emotional sense in the poem it finally makes sense to me, and I realize what I was actually saying and what I was actually getting at. And I think, and the same thing with reading other people's poetry, right? But that's what's so fucking awesome about poetry, is that there's this constant unfolding of meaning and playfulness every time you approach a poem. And a good poem will always surprise you in different ways. So it never settles on one thing, so it's constantly contradictory, but in its contradiction gets at the truth of something and has, shared meanings and things like that. So
I think that I both bring contradictions to start the poem, and also want the poem to hold them as contradictions. And especially in writing this book, I was thinking sort of about, I had this idea of diptychs or triptychs, of collages but separate things, and sort of putting things side by side that didn't need to have an answer at the end. And yeah, I think just think it's something that I like about poetry. I don't think I could be like an essayist because I think I sort of resist having a conclusion that the thought continues on the page.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like I'm a walking contradiction in a way. I was born to Panamanians who worked for the U.S. government at a moment when the U.S. was invading Panama, and we had a dictator who then declared my parents enemies of the state. And there's so much about my family and its story that's just born out of contradiction, sort of like, choose a side, And so I'm not really afraid of it, and I don't believe in it in a way. I just feel like we contain multitudes, as famous poet Walt Whitman said, and a lot of other people have opinions about what is a good match and what doesn't belong and all these kinds of things. But I just try to write my truth and write poems that explore the questions that I'm interested in answering, and I think sometimes people read that as contradiction. I just read it as complexity. And one of my favorite books of poetry that I've been returning to recently is Crush by Richard Seiken. And when I was in graduate school, I think it's the first time I read that book, and I thought to myself, how could love save someone like this, but also seem to lead them to ruin? And I think it taught me, it prepared me for dating in New York.
Yeah.
The brutality of that. Oh my God. Bianca, I'm so glad you brought up family as a site
You don't rely on me.
of great emotional contradiction. That's a core subject in my work. Love and hate, but also like how harm and care can seemingly coexist in families. Although I've been thinking a lot lately since Bell Hooks' passing, and everyone's returning to her book, All About Love, in which she talks about kind of redefining love in a very serious way as something that cannot coexist with abuse. And so she said there's a difference actually between care and love. And so I'm like, oh, I was cared for, but maybe not loved in the ways that I needed to be, which is like a devastating realization that I'm working through. So for the question though, it really depends on the poem, I would say. There's some where I go to write with a contradiction in mind or emotions that are in tension in some way, in friction. But that can be kind of dangerous for me if I'm too into an idea at the outset of like, this is what I'm going to explore. And then usually the poem, if I'm paying attention, will say, no, that's not what you thought it was going to be. And so these days I try to trust that, the writing process will take me where I need to go. Yeah.
It's funny because both Darrel and Chen Chen, you kind of hinted at something that was at my mind, and then at the same time something I was going to bring up next. What was on my mind as you all were replying was the way that you kind of were all seemingly describing also romantic relationships, like the way of relating to an other, right? Or the way that poetry is, in a sense, a living relationship and not something that is anchored in time. And so you can come back to a poem and feel totally differently about yourself in it, or the person you're writing, or even the words themselves. But I kind of wanted to underscore that because it seemed to resonate so much from answer to answer. But what I also wanted to return to was, Darrel, what you were bringing up about relating to the other always living thing, which is landscape. And something that I kind of came upon in each of your most recent books was this feeling of contending with the story or the narrative of the, quote, great American landscape, like some aspect of being American and being here. And I really wanted just to hear y'all talk about that kind of contention on a literal and figurative level, and how maybe touching upon pop culture or political culture has helped you root in or understand your relationship to it. Does that make sense?
Well, I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and upon moving there, I rented a car. No, I think I leased a car, and then I was driving around Detroit, and I had two experiences. One was that I couldn't get Diana Ross and the Supremes out of my head, and I had a flashback to the first time I ever heard the word Detroit, and it was when I was watching E! True Hollywood Story on Diana Ross. And it just helped me fall in love with the landscape, because I could place it within my own history. And so much of that had to do with popular culture, because when I was growing up, it was how I found out about the rest of the world. It's how I fell in love with Brazil was Brazilian cinema that I would get to watch when I was growing up in high school. So popular culture for me is oftentimes a key that I can use to unlock an entire world that I want to get to know better.
And there's still
the landscape of that world, very much so. I also, the second experience I had driving around Detroit that day was that there was I turned on the radio and there was no Latino radio station. And I immediately was like, oh my God, where am I? Because I had lived in Houston before, and Houston has lots of Latina media from Latin American Spanish and et cetera. And it also was a way of getting to know the landscape there. So it both made the sort of Diana Ross in my head, made the landscape feel familiar to me. And then the fact that there was no reggaeton on the radio made it also feel very foreign at the same time. So I think it's a way of accessing, understanding landscape, but also building landscape and like the imagination of my mind, right? Because then what I'm writing about is not the literal thing, but it's like my imagined version of Houston, or my imagined version of New York, my imagined version of Detroit, all based on my experiences there, mixed with memories, mixed with popular culture, mixed with history that I've read, et cetera, that all come into the poem.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I was just gonna say Rachel. I'm curious.
I'd say my book is a lot about landscape, and also sort of the human landscape, or different ways that people behave in different places. And I grew up in Alaska, where we sort of like didn't have popular culture, but also something I was thinking of in writing the book was sort of resisting whatever idea of Alaska exists in popular culture. I've just been seeing around Brooklyn today all these signs for this new Hilary Swank show that's set there, which I'm actually very excited to see. But it has such a mythos, and to write what was like a sort of urban Alaskan experience, and a Jewish Alaskan experience was one of the challenges of the book.
Yeah.
I've forgotten most of the question, but I was thinking, okay, I remember that, you were asking about referencing pop culture in order to like in landscape in order two very different things, in order to understand it better.
Well, I can sort of tailor, because I have read your book as well, but I feel like your book isn't. There are some poems that are specifically like about like the television poem or this idea, but your book seems to almost like reject a kind of like American culture, even as it's inside of it, right? So there, But I think I'm always interested, as you know, I'm also an immigrant myself, people writing inside of America in ways that sort of is grappling with their relationship to America and what it means to them. And for many of these books, there is a lot of like political mining. I would actually say that a lot of your religious poems are also a kind of political mining as well, right? Because that religion is political to me. So I think that the question is just like how have these topics that you've fallen on, like religion, for instance, like the sacred, even especially with a pop twist, because some of your religious poems do have kind of like a kind of rejection of the sacred too in them. How do they help you negotiate your relationship to the American landscape, both figuratively, like the land, and also perhaps metaphorically, like being an American?
Well, I will say that the religious exploration was an incredible opportunity and transformation for me to find a sort of spirituality and a faith that I felt completely comfortable with. And I think I was at like a point in my life where I was incredibly desperate in search of a sort of surrender or release or comfort. I felt like so much of my newest book is like a searching, you know, and dealing with addiction and dealing with self-defeating habits and like mental illness and all of that. And really like craving, craving help and sort of looking around at the landscape which is offered and being really disappointed, and really having to do a lot of the work of research and investigation into, you know, I would say like ancient texts, you know, like, I mean, pop culture, yes, you know, I can't get away from Star Trek, like it comes into everything, every book, I would say, in some ways, but then also like the Gnostic Gospels do too, you know, so for me, those are both valid parts of our like human mythology, right? So I'm like, I think our pop culture, religion, Shakespeare, you know, the books we read, the things we surround ourselves with are our myths, our mythology, and especially in America where we don't have this rich history and religious background that grounds us, you know. We have a scattering of different things, but I think most prevalent is sort of like toxic institutional, you know, Christian religions and things like that just don't resonate, you know, on a deeper, like unconscious, you know, symbolic level that feels like it can offer you that much anymore. I mean, certainly for someone like me. So it's like an investigation, and I feel like for me, part of my poetic process is every time I do an interview, I get asked about my process, right? And I'm starting to think like part of my process is like an investigation, a constant investigation with the symbols and myths around me in my culture and in other cultures that I'm come up against in America, and just working that out in my own personal experience through poetry, which is, like we've been saying, perfectly suited for this weird contradictory exploration that's both ancient and totally new. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Chen now.
I try to put as much gay stuff in poems as I can. And I mean, there's a lot of like gay culture or queer culture that ends up being pop culture. And so I think about that a lot. But also, I grew up in New England, which sometimes I say I grew up in Gilmore Girls, for better or definitely worse. And I have a pug dog. It's named Mr. Giles, which is from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So, like, pop culture is, yeah, it's just my daily experience. So increasingly, it just felt weird not to go there. But specifically, a lot of the new book, it's set in Lubbock, Texas, where I did my PhD program. And I experienced the 2016 election. Right? Trump is pop culture, for better or worse. And so I was in a very conservative part of the country, conservative part of Texas, during that time. But I was also really fascinated by the differences in landscape and season, having grown up in New England and being used to like 4 very distinct, super dramatic seasons. It felt very different in West Texas. Incredibly flat, the sky, was huge, that Texas sky, and just like the desert and these windy plains, the flatness of that. And so much of that I found really beautiful. And it was such a strange experience, and I write through that in a couple different poems in this new book, experiencing simultaneously this great beauty and this loneliness, this isolation at the same time. So I was really drawn to feeling both, or just became obsessed with writing about it, being enchanted but disconnected at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of queer writers have like a third culture, that makes sense to me. I have a lot more questions to ask in my mind, but I also think that it might be time to open up to audience questions. So if anybody has a question, you might raise your hands. And I don't think we have a mic person, or do we? Yes, person in the green.
What kind of, I guess, think of play, play techniques do you find yourself playing around with in your writing? Is it, do you find yourself playing around with rhythm more often, or trying to paint pictures that are different than necessarily just the way language kind of conveys information? So, I don't know, what kind of forms do you find yourself delving into recently that feel playful with readers?
Just to reiterate for people who might be a little bit hard of hearing, the question has to do specifically with form and how form finds its way into your process when it comes to play.
One thing that I've been doing recently is playing with this idea of writing a photo negative of a poem. So this is a revision exercise. And I learned this at Breadloaf. I don't remember who taught it to me. Apologies to whoever is listening to this, and they're like, I taught him to do that! But you write a poem, and then you write whatever you consider to be a photo negative of the poem. So you'll take a value or a concept or a phrase, and then you'll write the opposite of it. It's obviously not an exact science, but it's whatever it means to you. And it'll help you think about what's in between and what goes unsaid. I've been doing that, but throwing translation into it. And so I've been writing it in English, and then writing the photo negative version in Spanish, and then thinking about including like a counter argument, to use essay language, in the English version of the poem, and then importing some of the Spanish, or going back and forth and just giving myself more to play with there. So that's just one example of the kind of play that you could do with a poem.
I think something that felt playful for me in writing the book was including more people in it. Or a lot of the book is about a relationship, and I feel like to be in a relationship is sort of like improvisatory, and a lot of it is playful. I don't know. I feel like a lot of what I say during the day is just like a silly joke to my partner. So I think setting up someone else to be in conversation with in a poem too also allows you to surprise yourself a little bit.
I think it's such a good question and area of thought for any poet, because there is this you know, you could focus all on the narrative or the sort of what's being said in the poem, and you can also focus on playing with how it presents on the page. And really, both are equally important. And determining the form on the page and trying to figure out the right form for the poem is, I don't know, it's sometimes the poem sort of knows on its own, and then other times you struggle more, because I feel like I have the most struggle when it's something I really want to write about and I can't figure out, the form is not working, right? So it's, I have this, I'll even say I'll have a story that I really want to tell in a poem. I have a subject that I really want to explore, and those are always the hardest poems for me to write, because they don't, the form hasn't determined itself before the subject. And I have to do a ton of playing on the page to get it right. And it's torturous, and it feels like a lot of times I just give up altogether, but sometimes I want to do it so badly that it's some sort of masochistic exercise that just goes on and on and on, and then you finally get it right, and the payoff is really big. And usually it turns into a large part of your book, and a longer poem. But listening for the rhythm is the key for me here, because I never want to lose the musicality and the lyricism of a poem over my desire to convey an idea, right? So it's playing. It's like playing around with an instrument and trying to figure out the tune, and what, you know, how big the band's going to be, how epic the song's going to be. And I feel like that's the work of being a writer, and it feels sometimes like you're wasting time, but you're not, because that's what it is. It's like a lot of process, and patience and defeat, and then, but again, to just constantly come back to this idea of play, you have to think of it as play. Otherwise, it feels like work, and that's, and you have to
The worst.
Yeah. Even though it is work, I think, but like that's where the creativity and ingenuity and surprise at least ends up happening. And form is there's rules, but there's also so much room to improvise and invert the rules and make it into a negative and all that stuff. So, yeah.
I'll just quickly mention a form in this new book that came from a workshop assignment that I hated because it was to write like an anagrams poem, so rearranging letters, but you could only use your name, so the letters in your name, and my name is Chen Chen. So I had 4 letters in total to work with. I tried really hard.
That's so hard.
With those letters. It was like he, hen. That's it. And so then I remembered that, yeah, it's a great word, yeah. Then I remembered when I was growing up, my name would show up on class rosters as like Chen, no middle name, Chen. So then I used that to get some extra letters. And then it became a really playful process from there. Like I almost had more fun just generating like the word bank from the available letters than I did working on the poem itself. But it also made revision really tricky and fun and challenging because yeah, I could only pick words from there. But there were, yeah, surprises along the way. Like one of them was like dahlia was like a word that I could use. So yeah, it became fun as I bent the rules.
Score. Oh, there's a person in the back. Oh.
Poems.
Okay. Yes. I love that. Maybe, yeah, if we have time, and I'm just here, so. Maybe if y'all could choose a poem that you think is an example of playfulness that you have on you. Could be from your book. It could be something you're working on now. No pressure. First one to find one can begin.
I can go.
Yeah.
This is a poem called Summer. Basically, you just need to know that Jigglypuff is a Pokemon. Like, you should know that. And Jigglypuff evolves into Wigglytuff. It's a beautiful transformation. Summer. You are the ice cream sandwich connoisseur of your generation. Blessed are your floral shorteralls, your deeply pink fanny pack with travel-size lint roller, just in case. Level of splendiferous in your outfit, 200. Types of invisible pain stemming from adolescent disasters in classrooms, locker rooms, and quite often Toyota Camrys, at least 10,000. You are not a Jigglypuff, not yet a Wigglytuff. Reporters and fathers call your generation the worst, which really means queer kids who could go online and learn that queer doesn't have to mean disaster or dead. Instead, queer means splendiferously you. And you means someone who knows that common flavors for ice cream sandwiches in Singapore include red bean, yam, and honeydew. Your powers are great, are growing. One day you will create an online personality quiz that also freshens the breath. The next day you will tell your father, you were wrong to say that I had to change, to make me promise I would, to make me promise and promise.
Beautiful, thank you. I had a 5-minute warning, so it's like a short poem time.
I'll read a really short one. Autobiography. I didn't come from the fresh jelly of the body. Mold grew me. Engulfed, the flowers overgrew. Poetic affluence acquired me on the cheap. Chairs broke me. Bags of clothes and papers left too long in sheds. The smell of their blight was the smell of my youth. Anonymous fetid colonies built the embryo in its damp quilts and soft books. I aged into being like a prison alcohol in the back of a toilet, fatherless. The first puddle never stirred. It was a toadstool that decided my sex. A symbiotic colony of bacteria coaxed me out of ignorance into ignorance.
I'll also read a short one. This is called Beacon. She told me, Will said on the phone, of the woman he had once described as a more feral me, that when she found out who you were, she screamed. I knew how smug I was with Chris, developing an interest in candles for the home. It wasn't that I loved him more than everyone before him, but I felt now that people had been wrong in emphasizing how much work relationships required. The days when he was gone, I studied the squirrels and my wall calendar and felt as lonely as a mom. Will and I had shared an office and had a sort of joke where we played at being office workers, mashing the keyboard like kittens, puppet jawing into the phone. There was a skunk I also watched, though I had thought that skunks preferred the nighttime. There were no skunks where I grew up, and then, for a while, I learned nothing new about animals.
I'm going to read a definition poem in my book. It's called Baby. I think it's the shortest poem in the book. So, here we go. Baby. Auburn, gold, and blossom cherry, our fingers 2 rings, and my tongue along your ear, electric lighter, gas stove, good time, praying for lightning. Baby, man-made, made man fire. Baby, This woman's need for the family lost to guerrilleros, this man's efforts to be her village, inferno. Baby, a bump barring in the words, I don't love you anymore, as he kisses her belly for the Christmas card photo. Baby, the end of an argument in the emergency room. Baby, what we lost in the flames. Baby, to nurse, cure with promises, a cocktail of words, each word mixed in to strengthen the other. Marry me anyway. Baby, to link by umbilical cord, to cut the cord and hit the thing's bottom so we hear it breathe. Baby, to hear silence instead.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you all for coming. The authors will now sign their books at the signing table. The community bookstore.